Okay, let's unpack this. We live in an age that is supposedly defined by our deference to credentialed expertise. We have experts guiding policy on, well, everything, from climate modeling to infectious disease containment. Yet, and this is the paradox, trust in those very experts and the major institutions that house them, it seems to be collapsing faster than ever.
It really is the defining paradox of modern governance, isn't it? I mean, we are constantly bombarded with this command to follow the science.
Yeah.
Yet the sources we analyzed, they argue that the increasing misuse and overreach of expertise are, ironically, fueling the very populist skepticism it wants to eliminate.
Right. It's like the cure is actually making the disease worse. And so we need to understand why so many people are actively choosing not to follow the lead of, the anointed few.
And to do that, I think we have to start with the most fundamental question, which is, what exactly is an expert?
Yes. We pulled two incredibly insightful but also really contrasting definitions from the sources, and they immediately frame the tension in this whole deep dive. On one hand, you have just the incredible humility of the physicist Richard Feynman.
Oh, Feynman's definition is almost a philosophical challenge to the entire concept of authority. He said, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts.
Which sounds so counterintuitive at first.
It does, but it's not a celebration of ignorance. It's a recognition that the truly knowledgeable person understands the vast, vast frontier of what they don't know. It insists on continuous inquiry, and it distrusts final answers.
It puts the premium on the method, not the person, not the credentials.
Exactly.
But then we have Werner Heisenberg, who offered a far more practical, almost tactical definition for what makes a good expert.
Right. Heisenberg suggests an expert is someone who knows the worst mistakes that can be made in the subject and how to avoid them. This is expertise as practical competence, a deep understanding of limits and fallibility. And that perhaps is the most crucial difference between true expertise and let's call it the credentialed pose we often see in public life today.
That's a great way to put it, a credentialed pose.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we look at how expertise is presented in the media, it rarely embodies that humility or that deep awareness of potential mistakes. It usually seems to mean the person who claims infallible, undeniable certitude.
Precisely. The person with all the answers. And when the public sees that, they see someone shutting down debate, asserting a kind of moral or intellectual superiority. And that lack of visible humility, it's just fatal to long-term trust.
So our core mission here, as we wade through all these sources, is to move beyond the easy dismissal of populist movements. We need to determine if this rising skepticism is merely anti-intellectual rage, or if it is, in fact, a completely rational and justified defensive response to a demonstrated, repeated pattern of elite failure, overreach, and, frankly, the closing of the intellectual mind.
And we have to acknowledge the context here. I mean, the cultural inflation of the term expert shows how ubiquitous this problem has become. It's not just a political matter. It's woven into the fabric of our consumer culture.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where the data gets really fascinating. It shows exactly how obsessed we've become with the label. We looked at headline usage, specifically in the New York Times, as a sort of proxy for the cultural discussion. Between 1954 and 1999, a span of 45 years, the term expert or experts appeared in headlines only 15 times.
15 times. In nearly half a century. Just let that sink in. The whole concept of relying on a panel of anonymous, definitive experts for daily guidance, it just wasn't a feature of public discourse. Not during the Cold War, not through the rise of the internet. It wasn't there.
It wasn't. But then you jump forward to the modern era. In the year 2021 alone, the term decorated more headlines than it had in that entire previous 45-year period combined.
Wow.
We are utterly saturated. It signals a fundamental shift in how we approach knowledge and authority. Our culture is now, as the sources say, obsessed with expertise, or maybe the idea of it.
It's become a cultural commodity, hasn't it? It's a required stamp of approval, what the sources call an imprimatur of credibility for anything, no matter how trivial.
And that leads to the proliferation of these just absurd, degraded imitations. So alongside the policy experts, you are now inundated with gift experts, tailgating experts, vacuum experts.
Yeah, I saw a Wordle expert the other day.
A Wordle expert, exactly. We've turned expertise into a clickbait headline, and it cheapens the currency of legitimate knowledge. It makes it harder for you, the listener, to distinguish between the truly insightful physicist and, the professor who is an expert on the history of scented candles.
That's the critical point. When the media presents the views of a vacuum expert with the same gravitas and confident certainty as a nuclear physicist, The public just learns to mistrust the label. It reinforces the skepticism that maybe, just maybe, the real experts are just slightly more credentialed talking heads.
That proliferation of experts in the media, it paints a picture, but it's the elite political class, the ones actually making the consequential policy, who are really driving this trust crisis. So let's zoom in on the specific group being critiqued, the elite. How do we define that term without making it simply a political slur?
Well, we have to define it neutrally, focusing on shared characteristics that we pulled from the sources. And the defining characteristic of the modern elite is academic credentialism. These are the individuals found in the high-status institutions, academia, government administration, the senior ranks of the media, major think tanks.
They're generally urban, often politically left of center, particularly on social and cultural issues. And they project that confident, high-performing professional demeanor that comes from succeeding in these very competitive, knowledge-based economies.
And this demographic reality, it creates what the sources call the diploma divide.
Mm.
And this is arguably the deepest social fissure in Western politics today. It's the ultimate source of so much of this friction.
The numbers here are just stunning. They really explain the alienation so many people feel. If you look at the American public over the age of 25, fewer than 40% hold a 4-year college degree. So the majority of the country does not possess the credential that defines the elite class.
Right. Now, contrast that with the people writing the laws. Fully 94% of the House of Representatives and 99% of the Senate hold at least a bachelor's degree.
Around 89%.
It's almost total. And the concentration is even more striking at the apex. The sources noted that about 1 in 10 members of the House and 1 in 8 in the Senate hold a degree from a single prestigious institution, Harvard.
A single university. That concentration of educational attainment, it doesn't just represent a policy bias. It represents a profound experience gap. I mean, how can a body composed almost entirely of Ivy League educated lawyers and policy wonks genuinely understand the economic, cultural, and psychological reality of the majority of Americans who lack that diploma?
And the problem is compounded by a huge political shift. For decades, the Democratic Party was the party of the working class, the non-college educated American. But that trend, it fundamentally flipped around 2004. It marked a transformation from focusing on labor issues to emphasizing the concerns of the educated elite. The sources note that since 2016, the wealthy even vote Democratic more often than the middle class does.
So we have a political system that is now governed by a highly educated, credentialed, economically comfortable minority, a minority that has increasingly distanced itself from the economic and cultural realities of the majority. This educational insulation, it provides the perfect context for the 3 specific elite mindsets, the sources argue, directly fuel this populist backlash.
Right. And these 3 mindsets are toxic because they remove the possibility of mutual respect and debate. The first one is condescension.
And this isn't just a friendly disagreement. This is a deep-seated disdain for the average citizenry. They're viewed not just as wrong, but as fundamentally ignorant, often manipulated by misinformation. And crucially, this disdain is paired with an unquestioning belief in the elite's own benevolence and intellectual superiority. They are convinced they know best, and if you disagree, well, it must be because you're dumb.
The second mindset flows directly from that belief in superiority, technocratic paternalism. This is the misguided but deeply, deeply ingrained view that facts alone, entirely divorced from messy political values, can and should settle all important public debates.
And this manifests in that familiar and I think deeply frustrating axiom, follow the science. It treats complex, multifaceted societal choices, like balancing a national budget or managing a pandemic, as purely technical problems, like they're problems to be solved by engineers, not value choices that must be negotiated by citizens in a democracy.
And when you combine that condescension with the belief that science settles all debates, you arrive at the third mindset, intellectual tyranny. This is the assumption that any dissent from the established elite consensus must be irrational, emotional, or the result of intentional bad faith or manipulation by, dark forces.
Is it always tyranny, though? Or is it sometimes just a fundamental failure to communicate? I mean, if 97% of climate scientists agree on a physical phenomenon, doesn't the 3% automatically feel like bad faith to the people in that consensus?
That's the nuance we have to grapple with. The sources emphasize that the effect of this behavior, regardless of the intent, is tyrannical because it forecloses debate. If you disagree on a complex trade-off, you're no longer merely wrong, you are anti-science or misinformed. The debate ends before it can even begin.
So the elite, in this scenario, doesn't just inform policy. They assert their political leanings are the inevitable result of their superior, educated understanding of the world.
Precisely. It's a pose, a misuse of credentialism. They are adapting their views to the professional norms of their high-status jobs and then asserting that those norms are objective truth.
And the political theorist Michael Sandel, he highlighted the truly undemocratic effect of this. It fundamentally excludes the majority of voices from the political sphere. When elites continually embrace the vocabulary of smart versus dumb, they are expressing a fundamental disinterest in the, uninformed but often grounded opinions of their fellow citizens. They assume all problems have technocratic solutions that only they, the credentialed, are qualified to identify and apply. And that is a direct challenge to the democratic principle of equal voice.
Absolutely. Which I think is a perfect bridge into our main case study, because part one gives us the context, part two provides the painful evidence. The sources argue that the recent global pandemic provides the perfect and perhaps most damaging case study in the misuse of expertise and the subsequent rapid collapse of public trust.
The defining slogan of the pandemic, "Follow the Science," was not in practice a statement of humility or inquiry. It was, as the sources put it, a painful abuse of the idea of expertise. It wrongly implied that complicated trade-offs over profound societal values like freedom of movement versus disease suppression were simply technical matters, not matters of public judgment. And this just crippled discussion and debate when we needed it most.
That whole sentiment was condensed perfectly into that infamous quote from Dr. Anthony Fauci. He said, "Attacks on me, quite frankly, are attacks on science."
And that was such a critical error, wasn't it? It conflated one person's policy views, which were often contingent, rapidly changing, and involved severe economic and social costs, with the entire immutable scientific enterprise. It made criticism of the policy equivalent to heresy against the truth itself.
Right. And the actual challenge facing governments was never purely scientific. It involved these incredibly complex, value-laden trade-offs. We weren't just balancing immunology against the virus. We were balancing immunological health against economic stability, against mental health, against educational gaps, against fundamental liberty. Science can inform us about disease transmission, but it cannot tell us whether the value of protecting the economy outweighs the value of mandatory indoor masking. That is a political, ethical, and moral judgment for the public to make.
And when that uncertainty is driven out, and a premature consensus is declared with maximal confidence, it dramatically increases the likelihood that a deeply mistaken policy will be adopted in its most extreme form. And as we know, bad policy is always sticky. It's hard to reverse. The prime example the sources focus on is the disastrous policy of sustained school closures.
This was textbook expert overreach. The policy debate was wrongly framed by public health elites as solely an infectious disease transmission problem. And that made it nearly impossible to discuss the collateral damage being inflicted on children and families. Officials engaged in this intense risk exaggeration, creating an atmosphere of hysteria to enforce compliance.
The language they used, it was almost shocking in its intensity. Take the New York City Schools Chancellor, Richard Carranza. He stated in July 2020, "We can make up learning for students. We cannot bring a student back who is infected and passed away."
Or even more hysterically, a school board president who reportedly asked parents, "Do you want your child to be alive or educated?" This presentation of policy choices as a binary life or death decision rather than a complex social trade-off involving risk assessment, it just fundamentally inflamed the public. People knew intuitively that this framing was false.
And what happens after such severe overreach? The denial of harm. Once the academic and developmental damage from closures became undeniable, the head of the powerful Los Angeles Teachers Union, she attempted to deny learning loss existed at all. She claimed instead that children learned resilience, they learned survival, they learned critical thinking skills.
A dismissal that was, rightly interpreted by frustrated parents who are often juggling work and childcare and witnessing their children suffer as an attempt to downplay the severity of the situation and to protect the professional interests of the union.
And it directly fueled political backlash. It became a major mobilizing issue in the Virginia governor's race, which flipped the state and signaled the political consequences of ignoring parental concerns.
The combination of failed policy, policy denial, and just rampant hypocrisy created a fertile ground for skepticism.
Oh, the hypocrisy. Masking mandates provided a continuous stream of it. We saw the policy flip-flops. First, we were told masks were ineffective or unnecessary. Then we were told they were essential. Then came the belated recognition that outdoor masking was medically absurd, and the later scientific acknowledgement of the limited effectiveness of cloth masks. The changes just eroded credibility day by day.
And the populists, particularly this nascent populist movement, has what the sources describe as a sensitively tuned antenna for hypocrisy.
Hmm.
And they saw the countless photographs of unmasked politicians at fundraisers, restaurants, parties, often standing right next to staff or children who were masked.
It sent such a clear message. The rules applied to the governed, but not to the governing class. The elites could buy their way out of the strictures or simply ignore the guidance they imposed on others. That visual betrayal is incredibly difficult for any authority to recover from.
And the policy decisions around children, those were deeply unsettling and drove many parents toward active dissent. The mandatory, sustained masking of toddlers and young children, for example, made the U.S. an international outlier. It defied the World Health Organization guidance.
The sources highlighted a particularly disturbing moment when a top Biden pandemic advisor referred to children in a technocratic analysis as mosquitoes who should circulate less or will become vectors. That kind of language, which views developing human beings not as students or individuals, but merely as disease vectors, it only widened the cultural schism. It reinforced the feeling that elites were detached, viewing the public as just pieces on a chessboard.
And finally, the quick suppression of doubt around masking was highly damaging. The idea of running rigorous randomized control trials, the gold standard for gathering evidence on mask efficacy in schools, it was quickly declared unethical by many institutional leaders.
Which means we essentially imposed a massive, costly social policy on an entire generation of children, claiming maximal confidence, while actively preventing the collection of the high-quality evidence that would have shown whether the policy even worked. Instead of saying, we don't know for sure, but we will collect the evidence while implementing, the mandate was imposed and all dissent was silenced. This is an environment that is just ripe for skepticism.
It's the inevitable reaction, isn't it? The natural reaction to this consistent pattern of elite overreach, policy failure, and the suppression of legitimate questions is the rise of populist skepticism.
And we need to be careful not to define populism simply by the loudest political figures. We have to define it from the bottom up by the voters and their underlying motivations.
At its most fundamental level, populism is the rejection of the elites by the masses. It is not, as the media often frames it, a single, unified right-wing political ideology. It is a response to deep, widespread dissatisfaction and a perceived failure of liberal democracy to deliver on its promises.
This is a crucial distinction that often gets lost in, cable news analysis. The sources make it clear there's significant ideological overlap among these anti-establishment voters. We have specific data from 2016 showing a substantial 19% subset of Trump voters who were middle-class, educated, and held strongly progressive economic views.
That's right. They overwhelmingly favored increasing taxes on the rich, they deeply distrusted elites in both parties, and they believed the system was rigged. These are values they share almost entirely with the voters who supported Bernie Sanders.
They aren't united by specific policies, but by a shared, visceral sense that the current system is failing them and that the people in charge are either corrupt or incompetent.
So populism is essentially a response to being told there are no choices.
Hmm.
That all the big questions, globalization, immigration, healthcare, have been settled by technocrats when the consequences of those settled policies are clearly feeling the majority. It's driven by that potent trifecta of economic, cultural, and political grievance.
And at the heart of this response is skepticism, which, historically speaking, is not the enemy of democracy. It's a necessary, healthy, democratic impulse.
Absolutely. So, some philosophers have argued that wholesale skeptical doubt has led to a general lack of concern for accuracy and the truth. The skepticism we're analyzing here is not some radical philosophical belief that we can never truly know anything for certain.
No, it's far more grounded. It's what we call moderate skepticism. It's practical doubt driven by experience.
Let's use that common sense example from the source material.
Mm-hmm.
The parent and the dented fender. The teenager claims he has no idea how the large dent got in the side of the family car. Maybe someone hid it overnight in the grocery store parking lot.
And while that's technically possible, right? Moderate skepticism starts with finding the most plausible explanation based on experience. And the most plausible explanation is usually that the teenager made a mistake while driving. You don't have to be a philosopher or an automotive expert to make that judgment. It's just common sense and probability.
And yet, this venerable tradition of skepticism championed by thinkers like Descartes and Hume, is now often deemed dangerous or anti-intellectual by the elite class. They confuse the healthy democratic impulse to ask, "Show me the evidence and tell me why I should trust your judgment," with outright hostility to facts.
And what's so compelling is that the source material offers repeated, tangible cases where that lay wisdom, that common sense skepticism, proves superior to narrow expert certitude. The Chernobyl sheep farmer's anecdote is perhaps the most powerful illustration of this.
This happened after the Chernobyl accident in 1986. Radioactive clouds drifted over parts of the UK, contaminating sheep grazing land. And government scientists, relying on highly technical, narrow expertise in physics and biology, predicted that the radiocesium contamination on the sheep would be short-lived, a matter of weeks or months. So they initially argued against long-term compensation for the farmers.
But the farmers, relying on centuries of detailed, localized knowledge about their soil composition, the specific drainage patterns in the Cumbrian fells, and how certain minerals retain substances, they predicted the contamination would persist for a very long time. They understood the local variables the scientists had completely ignored.
And the scientists were, to quote the sources, proven spectacularly wrong. The farmers were right. The contamination lasted for decades. The scientists, in their narrow focus, had fundamentally misunderstood how radiocesium would behave in that specific complex soil ecosystem. It demonstrates the fundamental limit of narrow, imported expertise when it dismisses crucial lay insight.
A more recent and more politically charged example is the COVID-19 lab leak hypothesis. When Jon Stewart on a late-night show offered the common-sense observation that the disease is the same name as the lab, he was offering moderate skepticism based on observational plausibility.
Yet the elite consensus, driven by media figures and academics, immediately mocked the idea. They labeled the lab leak a right-wing fringe conspiracy theory with a near-zero probability. It was dismissed purely on ideological grounds, not on scientific merit.
And subsequent evidence, of course, showed the theory was highly plausible, if not likely. Emails later revealed that many scientists had dismissed the theory immediately, specifically for political reasons, to avoid collaboration with conservative voices, not because the science actually ruled it out. Common sense, in this case, identified the crack in the expert assertion where ideology had taken over.
And finally, we have the widely mocked phenomena of patients who feel compelled to do their own research. While we all know the dangers of catastrophizing after Googling symptoms, the practice of patient advocacy challenging doctors, asking pointed questions, seeking second opinions, has demonstrated clear benefits in treatment outcomes.
Indeed. For those with rare or complex diseases, patient advocacy and networking have often led to crucial medical breakthroughs and better treatment protocols. And this often happens in the face of initial disbelief or dismissal from the medical profession itself.
The lesson here is so critical. The goal is not to replace the expert with Google, but to recognize that the most beneficial process requires balancing expertise with lay insight. Even the most technical medical decisions involve complex, non-mechanical value trade-offs that properly belong to the patient, not to the doctor alone.
Which I think pivots us to the next logical point. We've spent a lot of time discussing the misuse of expertise. Now let's get into the intrinsic critique from the sources. The flawed foundation of contemporary academic research itself, and how systemic failures make the knowledge we rely on less trustworthy than we assume.
This takes us deep inside what's called the ideas economy, an economy that prioritizes sensational findings and personal marketing over the slow, rigorous, often boring pursuit of truth. And few examples illustrate this better than the rise and the dramatic fall of power posing.
Ah, yes. The famous 2012 TED Talk by Amy Cuddy, which has, nearly 70 million views worldwide. The simple, seductive idea. Stand like Superman for 2 minutes before a big meeting, and your body language fundamentally changes your hormones and confidence levels, an instant life hack.
It was an incredible success story in the public sphere based on a 2010 published study. But the sources highlight the subsequent failure of the science. The original findings were later retracted, and crucially, Cuddy's primary collaborator, Dana Carney, openly disavowed the research.
She stated very clearly that the effects are unlikely to be real and that the topic is not worthy of additional research. Now, that is scientific integrity, but the damage is done. The idea is still circulating today as a robust psychological fact despite being falsified.
It demonstrates how often science is used as a marketing ploy in this ideas economy. Not to inform policy or knowledge, but to promote quick, satisfying life hacks or to justify a preferred political stance. Hype and virality just outweigh rigor.
And the problem goes so much deeper than just bad ideas that fail to replicate. Systemic failure is rife. We've seen an alarming increase in fraud. Since 1975, the number of articles retracted in scientific journals for fraud or serious misconduct has increased tenfold. That's a profound betrayal of public trust.
And worse still is the systemic issue of the replication crisis, particularly in the social sciences. Many celebrated findings, the things that make headlines and often influence policy, they simply don't hold up when other research teams try to reproduce them. And if a finding is not repeatable, it is not knowledge. It's just an artifact.
Which brings us to a foundational and deeply disturbing critique of modern research culture. John Ioannidis' highly cited 2005 paper, and it carried the blunt title, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. That statement alone should force every policymaker and elite institution to just stop and reassess.
It absolutely should. How can that be? How can most findings be false?
Well, his core claim is now widely accepted in the field of metascience. He argues that for most study designs and settings in modern research, it is mathematically more likely for a research claim to be false than true, even if you set fraud aside.
It's incredible.
It stems from three critical factors. One, researchers are increasingly focused on finding increasingly small effects, which are much harder to distinguish from random noise. Two, there's pervasive publication bias. Journals prefer publishing exciting, positive findings over boring, null results. And three, the practice of p-hacking, where researchers subtly manipulate their data or methods until they find a statistically significant result, which is often spurious.
So we have a system that is structurally geared to reward the false positive, the flashy finding that doesn't actually hold up. And this problem is particularly acute when research relies on the most common form of social and health science data, observational studies.
Yes, observational data is easy to gather, but it's dangerously difficult to use for determining causation. A classic, almost textbook example is the research that consistently links moderate wine drinking to longevity. Let's say the data show that people who drink one glass of red wine a day live longer.
The temptation is to conclude the Rhine is the magical elixir. But, as the sources point out, we can't draw that causal link.
Precisely. The data are heavily confounded. Wealthier people who generally have better health care, better diet, lower stress, more socioeconomic advantages, they tend to drink more wine. The wine drinking is correlated with longevity, but the underlying factor, wealth and lifestyle, is the true cause. But researchers often present the wine as the finding because it's more exciting.
And when you try to control for those confounding variables, things like income, diet, exercise habits, marital status, you run right into Ioannidis' other concept, the vibration of effects. This is one of those academic concepts that really needs a serious conversational breakdown for the listener.
It's conceptually simple, but it's devastating in its implications. The vibration of effects suggests that the smaller the effect you are looking for, and remember, modern research focuses on small effects, the more sensitive the final statistical result is to minute methodological choices.
So if I'm studying the link between wine and longevity, the finding might vibrate. If I choose to control for income, the effect of wine might be significant. If I control for income and exercise, the effect might disappear. If I control for income, exercise, and proximity to fresh markets, the effect might become negative.
That's the vibration. The researcher can subtly move the result by choosing which controls to include or exclude. They might genuinely not be manipulating data, but their findings are so dependent on their subjective choices that it becomes extremely difficult to separate the genuine signal from random noise. The accumulation of facts is, emphatically, not the same as the accumulation of wisdom.
And the real-world consequence of this systemic fragility and exaggerated confidence is that ineffective or harmful medical practices become widely adopted. There are studies on what they call medical reversals, where standard practices like routine stenting for stable heart disease or the overuse of hormone replacement therapy are adopted with great confidence, only to be found ineffective or even harmful years later.
And every single one of those reversals, where the expert medical establishment has to tell patients, oops, what we told you was definitive for the last decade was actually wrong, it just erodes patient trust permanently. This brings us back to Michael Lewis's famous critique.
Right. Lewis argues that the fundamental problem is not a lack of expertise in the system, but a profound misallocation of prestige. We valorize the wrong people.
We valorize the bureaucratic talking heads, the politicians, and the administrators who have climbed the corporate or academic hierarchy, instead of the true experts who toil away in obscurity in the basements of government buildings, the people who are actually running the complex systems.
Lewis offered that anecdote of Arthur A. Allen, a Coast Guard employee who completely revolutionized maritime rescue operations, saving countless lives by applying common sense analysis and data. Yet, during a government shutdown, Lewis points out, Allen was furloughed as non-essential.
That story is highly effective at illustrating the paradox. The system rewards the visible generalist who provides the illusion of control and ignores the competent, obscure practitioner who delivers genuine, life-saving knowledge. However, the sources also offer a necessary critique of Lewis himself.
He often relies on hindsight bias, doesn't he? In books like The Big Short, he valorizes the few, true experts who saw the 2008 financial crisis coming.
But that's too easy. It's simple to find someone who was crying wolf retrospectively. Lewis himself fails to provide any systematically useful way to identify the right obscure experts in advance. It doesn't help set policy in the thick of a crisis. If we were to apply true skepticism, we would have to ask, for every Arthur Allen Lewis finds, how many other obscure, unrecognized experts were also wrong? Valorizing heroes after the fact doesn't solve the structural problem of institutional hierarchy.
So we've established that expertise is intrinsically flawed and often misused for political ends. Now we need to look at the institutional and ideological response to any form of criticism or doubt, the suppression of debate and the closing of the elite mind. Elites often react to public skepticism by assuming we live in a unique, novel, post-truth age defined entirely by misinformation.
And that elite panic, this idea that we've suddenly entered a historically unique era of fake news and conspiratorial thinking, it's often misguided. The sources point out that the best social science research shows there is no evidence that we live in an age uniquely defined by misinformation or conspiratorial belief compared to previous historical periods.
Historically speaking, every generation believes they are the first to experience rampant false information. John Adams, way back in the 1790s, complained bitterly of rampant fake news. He estimated that more new error was being propagated in the 10 years before 1798 than in the entire previous 100 years. Misinformation is the default state of politics, not some novel invention of social media.
Moreover, the panic wrongly frames misperceptions as a one-sided problem, usually targeting only right-leaning populist voters. But the data, they reveal significant political parity in believing falsehoods.
Can you give us a concrete example of that parity?
Certainly. The sources cited data showing that 34% of Democrats believed Republicans stole the 2004 election in Ohio, a foundational political falsehood at the time. That figure is entirely comparable to the share of Republicans who expressed doubts about the 2020 election result. The willingness to accept politically convenient, unproven claims is a human partisan phenomenon, not a feature of a single political identity.
So if the facts aren't entirely the problem, what is driving the polarization? It's motivated reasoning. This is another one of those concepts that needs careful unpacking for the listener.
Motivated reasoning is the psychological finding that people don't process information objectively. They process it in light of their prior beliefs, their values, or their group identity. We tend to quickly accept and overcredit evidence that confirms our commitment to a particular group, whether that's a political party, a profession, or a cultural identity, and rigorously scrutinize or reject evidence that challenges that commitment.
And here's the most counterintuitive, yet crucial: finding the sources illuminated. The more educated, the more numerate, the more capable people are, the more prone they are to this behavior. They're better at rationalizing their biases.
Right. Researchers demonstrated this using a simple experiment. Participants were presented with the exact same table of numbers and asked to interpret the data. When the table was framed as being about the efficacy of two skincare products, people overwhelmingly got the math right. They used their simple math skills to determine which product worked best.
But then, the researchers changed only the label. They presented the exact same table of numbers, but framed it as being about the effectiveness of a politically charged policy, specifically gun control. Suddenly, the math skills of the participants seemed to collapse.
And strikingly, the people who were most numerate, the most skilled at calculating the odds, were the most prone to political polarization. They often got the objectively correct mathematical answer wrong if it contradicted their political leanings. Their intelligence didn't make them more objective, it made them better at warping the data to fit their preconceived ideas. It demonstrates that the problem of confirmation bias is exacerbated, not solved, by intelligence and education.
And because the elite consensus operates from this position that facts settle all debates, the easiest way for them to avoid dealing with substantive dissent is to employ weaponized ad hominem attacks. They just declare the opponent irrational, ignorant, or part of a conspiracy.
We see this in the critique of entire schools of thought rather than engaging with the ideas themselves. Take the popular critique of public choice economics, the influential school that suggests politicians and bureaucrats act in their own self-interest, not always the public interest.
The sources mention Nancy MacLean's book, Democracy in Chains, which treats this entire influential economics school, which includes Nobel laureates like James Buchanan, as a malicious conspiracy or an operation designed to destroy democracy. It doesn't seriously engage with the arguments of scholars who likely arrived at their conclusions through good faith academic reasoning.
It's just easier to label the idea a conspiracy than to debate the substance of why bureaucrats might make self-serving choices. We saw the same critique by association deployed during the pandemic.
That was the dismissal of the Great Barrington Declaration, wasn't it? This was a statement signed by credentialed scientists, some of the most respected epidemiologists in the world, who advocated for focused protection rather than widespread lockdowns.
Yes. And the historian Naomi Oreskes dismissed the declaration not based on its scientific merit, which was highly debatable but certainly worthy of discussion, but because it was disseminated by the Libertarian American Institute for Economic Research. She dismissed them based entirely on their political agenda, even though the author's views stemmed from their own consistent scientific priors that predated that meeting. This is a deliberate critique by association designed to eliminate the idea from public discussion without ever having to refute its scientific substance.
This closing of the mind, this intolerance for viewpoint diversity, it manifests structurally inside our major institutions, leading to profound groupthink.
Academic conformity is rife, especially at elite institutions. The sources highlighted some staggering figures. At a place like Harvard, over 80% of faculty identify as liberal, with nearly 40% identifying as very liberal, while less than 1.5% choose conservative.
That is not a diverse intellectual environment. That is an echo chamber. And when the few voices that might challenge the prevailing consensus are silenced or simply non-existent, the institution loses its critical ability to self-correct.
This is confirmed by the subsequent opposition to arguments for viewpoint diversity. 40% of Harvard faculty, for instance, openly said they would bar anyone who worked in the Trump administration from holding a faculty appointment. This is ideological filtering, and it fundamentally undermines the academic community's ability to arrive at trustworthy truths because the method demands challenging priors.
And when an ideologically diverse group of writers, including conservatives, liberals, socialists, signed that famous Harper's Magazine letter in 2020, simply expressing concern about the weakening of norms around open debate and toleration of differences, they were met with immediate and intense backlash. Even the call for open debate is now seen as suspect.
And this has a corrosive effect on journalism, which historically served as the public's institutional skeptic against authority. The fear of both sidesism, the worry that giving voice to opposing views legitimizes falsehoods, has undermined journalism's traditional, vital role of questioning authority.
Instead, institutions like the New York Times have openly embraced an elite resistance role. While this might energize a segment of their readership, it severely damages their national credibility and hardens political disagreements because the public perceives they're no longer getting impartial facts, but highly curated advocacy from one side of the educational divide.
Which brings us back full circle to the core foundational issue, the fatal conflation of facts and values. Elites continually pretend that disputes presented as purely factual are actually deep, irreconcilable value conflicts.
Let's use climate change as the prime example. Experts overwhelmingly agree the climate is changing, and humans are the primary driver. That is the factual consensus. But that doesn't resolve the policy debate.
Not at all. The real debate is over how to counter it, and crucially, who should bear the costs. No expert, regardless of their PhD or modeling capability, has the capacity to decide these value choices for society. Is the correct solution restricting air travel for the middle class, placing the primary burden on developing nations like China and South America, or calculating the cost to the average American family struggling with inflation?
Those are ethical, political, and economic choices. They are matters of public judgment, not extra-political judgment granted to an anointed few. The danger of assuming a neutral, pre-political ground of facts is that it hardens disagreements and makes opponents seem illegitimate.
Right. If you claim that the only disagreement is over the science, you render your opponent anti-science, meaning they are morally and intellectually deficient. But if you accept that the disagreement is about values, about burden sharing, economic justice, and lifestyle choices, then fighting honestly over those values, though messy and difficult, is essential for a functioning democracy.
Okay, so to summarize our deep dive into these sources, the populist skepticism we're observing today, it's not a sign of a uniquely ignorant public.
No, rather, it is a rational, predictable backlash against a system where the credentialed elite routinely exaggerates the certainty of their expertise, uses that expertise to suppress legitimate dissent, and utterly fails to admit fallibility or policy mistakes. This overreach corrodes both the credibility of genuine expertise and the health of our democratic discourse.
By claiming technical superiority, the elite class displaces the necessary vital clash of political values, the heart of democracy, with the pronouncements of an oracular elite.
And the sources make it very clear that the failures of elite governance and the resulting breakdown of trust, they are not unique to the sensational events of the last few years. They are symptoms of a deep, systemic disregard for the governed that stretches back decades.
We have to remember these past betrayals to understand the depth of current skepticism. Think back to the Flint water crisis in 2014. Residents, lay citizens, complained repeatedly about a foul smell, a strange taste, and rashes in their water. The physical evidence was right there.
Yet city officials and experts repeatedly dismissed those complaints, often aggressively, maintaining the water was safe long after it was clear it wasn't. They ignored the common sense, lay knowledge of the people drinking the water until the disaster became undeniable. The reputation of expertise has not recovered in that region, and in many others, since that profound betrayal.
Or take the truly egregious example of the Luzerne County Cash for Kids scandal in Pennsylvania, a historic working-class stronghold. Two judges conspired to give unusually harsh juvenile sentences, sometimes for minor offenses like parodying a vice principal on MySpace, in exchange for kickbacks from for-profit detention centers. They sentenced over 2,300 kids in total.
And what makes this so relevant is the systemic failure of the elite oversight. Officials and experts, the FBI, the Pennsylvania Judicial Conduct Board, received complaints starting in 2004, but took no steps whatsoever to investigate or stop the corruption. It took concerted efforts by parents, local activists, and a legal advocacy group to finally sue and expose the corruption.
Luzerne County had voted for Obama twice, then flipped hard for Trump in 2016. These examples, the water crisis, the judicial corruption, they show that populism and intense skepticism emerge precisely where trust is repeatedly broken by institutional failure, and accountability for that failure is non-existent. The public responds with anger and skepticism when elites fail to deliver and refuse to acknowledge their mistakes.
Therefore, the key lesson for you, the listener, is not to blindly follow the experts, but to develop the critical discernment to understand the limits of their knowledge and the self-interested biases they often carry.
You must recognize that many issues presented as settled scientific consensus must be restored to their proper sphere, politics. This requires political judgment, a complex synthesis of facts, values, and consequences open to all citizens, not extra-political judgment granted solely to an anointed few.
The technocratic mindset, which dominated public policy for decades, is inherently terrified of the necessary contingency and ambiguity of democratic politics. It desperately believes that experts can somehow render judgments free of that messiness. But that belief is ultimately a fantasy.
So we encourage you to approach new information with relentless curiosity, a dash of humility about your own understanding, and the healthy skepticism that is not an enemy of knowledge, but is, in fact, foundational to the pursuit of truth itself. Keep questioning, keep reading, and never stop thinking for yourself.